The Recipe of Forgiveness, Chapter 1, A Faded Secret. The Nashville sun, usually so vibrant, cast long, weary shadows across Evelyn's living room. Dust motes danced in the golden light, a silent ballet in a house brimming with forgotten memories. 70 years had etched themselves onto Evelyn's face, lines of laughter, sorrow, and time itself. Her hands, gnarled with age, trembled slightly as she sorted through the detritus of a lifetime. Old photographs, yellowed letters, trinkets long forgotten. Her granddaughter Lisa, a whirlwind of modern efficiency at 40, watched with a mixture of fondness and mild impatience. Lisa had flown in from New York, a rare visit, primarily to help her grandmother declutter. "Gran, are you sure we need to keep every single receipt from 1972? Lisa's voice was warm, but her tone hinted at a desire for progress. Evelyn chuckled, a sound like rustling autumn leaves. "Every piece tells a story, dear. You just have to know how to listen." They were in the attic, a forgotten kingdom of trunks and boxes. The air hung heavy with the scent of aged paper and mothballs. Lisa, ever practical, had donned gloves and a face mask. Evelyn, stubbornly traditional, simply breathed it all in, as if inhaling the past itself. A small, intricately carved wooden box, tucked away beneath a pile of old linens, caught Evelyn's eye. Its lid was smooth, warm from years of gentle handling. Her breath hitched. Lisa, noticing her grandmother's sudden stillness, paused. "What is it, Gran?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. Her fingers traced the worn edges of the box. Slowly, reverently, she lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a single, brittle piece of paper. It was a recipe card, handwritten, the ink faded to a sepia tone. The title in looping cursive read, "Robert's Apple Crumble Pie." Lisa leaned closer, intrigued. "A pie recipe? Is it a family secret?" Evelyn picked up the card. Her eyes, usually sparkling with life, were distant, filled with a sorrow Lisa couldn't quite decipher. "More than that, darling." Her voice was barely a whisper. Lisa reached for the card, a fleeting thought of baking a forgotten family recipe. As her fingers brushed the paper, she saw it. On the back, almost invisible, penned in a faint, trembling script, were 3 words. "Will you forgive me?" The words hung in the dusty air. A silent question echoed across decades. Evelyn gasped, her face drained of color, her hand shaking so violently that the card fluttered to the floor. "No," she whispered, a raw, wounded sound. "No." Lisa knelt, picking up the card. "Gran, what is it? Who wrote this?" She looked at her grandmother, whose eyes were wide with a fear Lisa had never seen. "We're done here, Lisa." Evelyn's voice was sharp, unyielding. "Put it away. All of it. I don't want to see it." She turned abruptly, her slight frame rigid, and descended the attic stairs, leaving Lisa alone amidst the echoing silence of unspoken secrets. Lisa stood, the recipe card in her hand, the faded question burning into her mind. "Will you forgive me?" What profound sorrow lay hidden within those simple words? Who was Robert? And why did a simple recipe card hold such power over her grandmother? The Nashville sun, once a comforting presence, now felt heavy. Burdened by the weight of a secret Evelyn refused to share. Lisa knew, with a certainty that hummed in her bones, that her visit had just become far more complicated. Chapter 2. The Unspoken Past. The next few days were a tense dance around the unspoken. Evelyn, usually so open and cheerful, became withdrawn. Her eyes, whenever they met Lisa's, held a shadow, a silent plea not to pry. Lisa, however, was not easily deterred. The words on the back of the recipe card had burrowed deep into her mind, a puzzle she felt compelled to solve. She tried various approaches: casual questions about old friends, gentle suggestions about family history. Each attempt was met with a polite but firm deflection. "That's ancient history, dear," or "some things are best left buried." One afternoon, Evelyn sat on the porch swing, lost in thought, a half-knitted shawl forgotten in her lap. Lisa approached cautiously, a cup of tea in her hand. "Gran," she began, her voice soft, "about that recipe card. I just can't shake it. It felt important. What happened?" Evelyn sighed, a weary sound. She looked out at the azaleas, their blooms vibrant against the green. "Some pains are too deep to unearth, Lisa. They fester, and they poison everything if you let them out." "But what if keeping them buried is even worse?" Lisa pressed. "What if talking about it could heal something?" Evelyn finally turned, her gaze piercing. "You don't understand. You couldn't possibly understand." Her voice was laced with a bitterness Lisa had never heard before. "Some wounds never heal. They just scar over. And every now and then, something tears the scab off." Defeated for the moment, Lisa retreated, but her resolve only strengthened. If Evelyn wouldn't talk, Lisa would have to find the answers herself. She remembered her grandmother mentioning an old friend, Daniel, who owned a used bookstore downtown. Daniel had been a constant presence in Evelyn's life, a quiet, observant man who always seemed to know more than he let on. Perhaps he held a piece of the puzzle. The next morning, under the guise of exploring Nashville, Lisa made her way to the literary labyrinth, Daniel's bookstore. It was a charming, chaotic place, shelves overflowing with books, the air thick with the scent of paper and stories. Daniel, a man with kind eyes and a perpetually rumpled tweed jacket, looked up from behind a towering stack of first editions as Lisa entered. "Lisa, dear, what a surprise! Evelyn mentioned you were in town." His smile was warm, inviting. Lisa returned the smile, a hint of nervousness in her stomach. "Hi, Daniel. Yes, just helping Gran sort through some things. Actually, that's partly why I'm here." She carefully produced the faded recipe card. "Have you ever seen this before? It's an old apple crumble pie recipe." Daniel took the card, his brow furrowing slightly as he turned it over. His gaze lingered on the faint words on the back. A flicker of something. Recognition? Regret? Crossed his face. He cleared his throat. "Ah, yes. Robert's apple crumble pie. A classic." His voice was carefully neutral. "Do you know who Robert is?" Lisa asked, her heart pounding a little faster. Daniel hesitated, his gaze drifting over the spines of countless books. Robert was a friend from a long time ago. He and Evelyn, they were very close. "They were in love, weren't they?" Lisa pushed, a sudden intuition guiding her. Daniel's eyes met hers. He didn't confirm, but he didn't deny. "Some loves," he said softly, "are like rare books, beautiful, fragile, and sometimes tragically lost before their final chapter can be written." He handed the card back. "Evelyn keeps her memories close, Lisa. Closer than anyone knows." Lisa sighed, frustrated but not defeated. "She won't talk about it. She just shuts down." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's Evelyn for you. Stubborn as an old oak tree. But sometimes the past finds a way to speak, even when we try to silence it." He gestured vaguely around the store. "Memories have a way of hiding in plain sight. In old letters, in diaries, sometimes even in the books themselves. His words resonated with Lisa. Memories hiding in plain sight. Evelyn had been sorting through boxes. Had she missed something? Lisa thanked Daniel, her mind buzzing with new possibilities. As she left the bookstore, the Nashville Sun seemed to reveal more than it concealed. The answers, she realized, weren't just in what Evelyn said, but in what she refused to say. And perhaps, just perhaps, they were still hidden somewhere in that cluttered house, waiting to be found. Chapter 3: Whispers from the Past. Back at Evelyn's house, Lisa approached the task with renewed determination. She meticulously re-examined the boxes they had been sorting through, searching for anything that might offer a clue. Old photo albums, bundles of tied letters, forgotten trinkets, nothing seemed to jump out. Then, tucked away in the bottom of a cedar chest, beneath a stack of Evelyn's old teaching materials, Lisa found it. A small, leather-bound diary, its pages yellowed with time, its lock long broken. The inscription on the first page, in a youthful, elegant script, read simply, "Evelyn's thoughts." Lisa's heart quickened. This was it. She handled the diary with reverence, knowing she was about to step into her grandmother's deepest, most private world. She flipped through the pages, her fingers brushing over dated entries that spanned several years, from Evelyn's late teens to early 20s. The first entries were typical teenage musings, crushes, school anxieties, dreams of the future. But then a name began to appear with increasing frequency: R. R looked at me today. My heart nearly burst. Spent the afternoon with R by the creek. He understands me like no one else. R brought me wildflowers. I think I'm truly, madly, deeply in love. As Lisa read, a vivid picture began to form. Evelyn, young and vibrant, deeply in love with a man named Robert. The entries painted a portrait of a passionate, tender romance. They spent hours together, sharing dreams, making plans for a future that seemed boundless. The apple crumble pie recipe was mentioned often, always in connection with Robert. It was his grandmother's recipe, a comfort food he adored, and young Evelyn had learned to bake it especially for him, the symbol of her devotion. Then the tone shifted, subtle at first, a growing unease. R seems distant today. Is something wrong? A terrible fight with R. He said things. I said things. My heart aches. Silence. He hasn't come by. I don't understand. The entries became more desperate, more confused. Evelyn's world seemed to crumble around her. The last entry, dated almost exactly 50 years ago, was stark, heartbreaking. He's gone. Just like that. No word. No explanation. Did I do something? Is it all my fault? The recipe card. He left it on my porch, folded. No note. Nothing. Just those words on the back. Will you forgive me? Forgive him for what? For leaving me? Or did he mean, forgive me? I don't know. My heart is broken. I feel abandoned. I can never look at that pie the same way again. It used to be love. Now it's just a question I can't answer. Lisa closed the diary, tears blurring her vision. The weight of her grandmother's pain, decades old, pressed down on her. This wasn't just a simple breakup. This was a profound, unexplained abandonment that had scarred Evelyn deeply, leaving her with an unanswered question that had festered for 50 years. The recipe card with its plea for forgiveness wasn't just a memento. It was the final, agonizing piece of a shattered puzzle. Lisa looked at the recipe card again. Will you forgive me? Now, understanding the context, the words felt even more poignant, more desperate. Robert had left it. But why? What could have caused such a sudden, devastating rupture? And why had he never returned? She realized that the diary, while revealing Evelyn's pain, didn't provide the full story from Robert's perspective. What was his side? What had he needed forgiveness for? And why had he vanished so completely, leaving Evelyn in such agonizing limbo? The past, it seemed, had many layers, and Lisa had only just begun to peel them back. The mystery of Robert and the apple crumble pie deepened, beckoning her further into the labyrinth of her grandmother's forgotten heartache. Chapter 4: A Thread of Hope. Lisa knew she couldn't keep this diary a secret. Evelyn deserved to know that her anguish had been acknowledged, even if it meant reopening old wounds. She approached her grandmother that evening, the diary in her hand, her voice gentle. "Gran, I found something." Evelyn, knitting by the fireplace, looked up, her expression guarded. Her eyes immediately fixated on the worn, leather-bound book. Her hand trembled, and the needles clattered to the floor. My diary." Her voice was barely a whisper, filled with a mix of shock and dread. "Yes," Lisa said softly. "I read it, about Robert and the pie." A profound sadness settled over Evelyn's face. She looked away, towards the flickering flames in the fireplace. "I thought that was lost forever. Buried." "It was buried," Lisa agreed, "but maybe it's time to unearth it." "Gran, you wrote, 'My heart is broken.' I want to understand what happened. Why did he leave? Why did he ask for forgiveness if he was the one who abandoned you?" Evelyn remained silent for a long moment, the only sound the crackle of the fire. Then she took a deep, shuddering breath. When she spoke, her voice was raspy, laden with decades of unspoken pain. "Robert, he was everything to me. We planned to marry. He was going to start his own carpentry business, and I would teach music. Simple dreams, but they were ours. He was kind, artistic, so full of life." Her voice softened, a faint, bittersweet smile touching her lips. "He loved that apple crumble pie more than anything. Said it reminded him of home." "What happened, Gran?" Lisa urged gently. Evelyn's gaze drifted to a faded photograph on the mantelpiece. A young, radiant Evelyn, her arm linked with a handsome, smiling young man. "Robert." "There was a misunderstanding," Evelyn began, her voice gaining strength, as if unburdening herself was a physical act. "A terrible argument. His family? They were struggling financially. His father had made some poor investments. And my family, my father had inherited a good sum from an uncle. Robert, being proud, didn't want to be seen as a burden. He said he needed to prove himself, to make his own way before he could ask for my hand. I was young, impatient. I told him that love was enough, that we could build a life together, no matter what. But he saw it as pity. My words, meant as reassurance, came across as a challenge to his pride." She paused, a tear tracing a path down her wrinkled cheek. "That he was letting pride stand in the way of our happiness. He said I didn't understand what it meant to be a man, to provide. It escalated. Terrible things were said. I told him that if he truly loved me, he wouldn't let anything stop him from being with me. And he said I truly loved him, I would understand his need to do this alone. It ended with me telling him that if he walked away now, He shouldn't bother coming back. Evelyn closed her eyes, the memory still fresh, still stinging. The next morning, he was gone. He left that pie recipe on my porch, the one he loved so much, and on the back, "Will you forgive me?" I thought he was asking me to forgive him for leaving, for abandoning our dreams. I was so angry, so hurt. I never forgave him. I never looked for him. I told myself he wasn't worth it, but I never forgot him. Never. Lisa listened, her heart aching for her young grandmother. A misunderstanding, fueled by youthful pride and stubbornness, had shattered 2 lives. But why didn't he come back? Or send a letter? Why just disappear? Evelyn shook her head. I don't know. I assumed he moved away, started a new life. I tried to forget. I married your grandfather, a good man, a steady man. We had a wonderful life. But a part of me always wondered, always hurt. Gran, Lisa said slowly, a new thought forming. What if he did try to contact you? What if his letters never reached you? Or what if that "will you forgive me" wasn't about him leaving, but about something else? Something you said or did? Evelyn opened her eyes, a flicker of something Lisa couldn't quite place. Hope? Fear? And their debts. After all these years, it's too late, Lisa. Too late. But Lisa knew better. It was never too late for truth. And the faint words on the back of the recipe card suddenly held a different, more urgent meaning. Not a plea from an abandoning lover, but a desperate question from a man who perhaps regretted something else entirely. A man who might still be out there, waiting for an answer to a question that had remained silent for half a century. The thread of hope, fragile but present, had finally appeared. Chapter 5, The Unsent Letter. Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Robert's disappearance. Evelyn's story, while heartbreaking, felt incomplete. The possibility of lost letters or a message that never reached its destination gnawed at her. She thought about Daniel, the bookseller, and his cryptic remark, "Memories have a way of hiding in plain sight, in old letters, in diaries, sometimes even in the books themselves." Books. Evelyn had recently sold off a small collection of old novels, sentimental favorites that she no longer had space for. Lisa remembered her grandmother mentioning selling them to Daniel's store, the Literary Labyrinth, just a few weeks ago. Could something have been tucked inside one of those books? It was a long shot, but it was the only lead she had. "Gran," Lisa said, approaching Evelyn carefully, "do you remember which books you sold to Daniel recently?" Evelyn frowned, trying to recall. "Oh goodness, a few of my old classics. A copy of Wuthering Heights, an old poetry anthology, a collection of short stories by O. Henry. Why do you ask, dear?" Lisa fabricated a reason. "Just curious, Gran. I was thinking of picking up something new to read, and Daniel's store is so charming." Evelyn seemed to accept the explanation. The next morning, Lisa was at Daniel's bookstore before it even opened. He greeted her with his usual warm smile. "Back so soon, Lisa? Find yourself a new mystery?" Lisa took a deep breath. "Daniel, I need your help. My grandmother told me about the books she sold you recently. Do you remember which ones?" Daniel nodded, stroking his chin thoughtfully. "Ah, yes, Evelyn's collection. Very fine copies those were. I remember them well. Wuthering Heights, Sonnets from the Portuguese. And a particularly beautiful edition of O. Henry's complete works. The O. Henry one, it sold almost immediately. A gentleman picked it up just last week. He seemed very interested in it." Lisa's heart sank. "It sold? Do you remember who bought it? Daniel's brow furrowed. I don't usually keep track of individual buyers, Lisa. But he was an older gentleman, silver hair, walked with a slight limp. He paid in cash. And he lingered over the O. Henry for a long time. Said something about how much his mother had loved those stories, and that he hoped to find a specific edition, one from his youth. Lisa felt a jolt. Robert, was it possible? Daniel's description of the man, the interest in an old O. Henry collection, Evelyn's story about Robert's love for short stories. It was a thin thread, but it was a thread nonetheless. Daniel, did he say anything else? Anything about why he wanted that specific book? Daniel thought for a moment. He mentioned that his mother used to mark her favorite stories with little notes. He was hoping to find a similar copy, one that felt like home. A cold dread settled over Lisa. Evelyn had marked her books, all of them, including the O. Henry collection. What if Evelyn had placed something in that book long ago and forgotten about it? And what if Robert, searching for a piece of his past, had found it? Daniel, do you have any way of contacting him? Lisa asked, her voice urgent. Daniel shook his head. I'm afraid not, dear. Cash transaction, no name given. He was just another face in the crowd, albeit a memorable one. Lisa's mind raced. How could she find a man who bought a specific book decades after he had vanished from her grandmother's life? It seemed impossible. But then, a thought sparked. Nashville wasn't an enormous city, and old men with silver hair and limps often had routines. She thought of places where an older gentleman might spend his time. Parks, coffee shops, libraries. She decided to start with the public library downtown. It was a long shot, but she had to try. For the next few days, Lisa embarked on her own quiet pilgrimage. She visited the public library, the local coffee shops where seniors gathered for morning discussions, even a few of the smaller, independent bookstores. She described the man to librarians and baristas, always met with polite shrugs and apologies. Just as despair began to set in, on the fourth day, she spotted him, in a quiet corner of the main public library, hunched over a large, leather-bound book. Silver hair, a slight limp as he shifted in his chair, and in his hand a familiar-looking book, the O. Henry collection. Lisa's heart hammered against her ribs. It was him. It had to be. She approached him cautiously, her voice trembling slightly. "Excuse me," she began. "I couldn't help but notice your book. Is that an old edition of O. Henry?" The man looked up. His eyes, though clouded with age, held a surprising depth of kindness. "Indeed it is, young lady, a treasured possession. My mother's favorite." Lisa took a deep breath. My grandmother, Evelyn, had a similar copy. She recently sold it to a bookstore. I was wondering, did you buy it from the literary labyrinth? A flicker of surprise, then a slow, dawning recognition crossed his face. His eyes widened slightly. "Yes," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I did. A rather old copy with a beautiful inscription inside." "And did you find anything else inside it?" Lisa asked, her voice barely a whisper. He reached into the book, carefully extracting a folded, yellowed piece of paper. It was a letter, addressed to my dearest Robert. His hands trembled as he held it. "This," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "This was tucked inside. I found it just yesterday. I don't know why it was there. It's from Evelyn." Lisa felt a surge of relief, followed by a profound ache. A letter. After all these years, this was it, the missing piece. "Sir," Lisa said, tears welling in her eyes, "my grandmother is Evelyn. She's been looking for answers about you for 50 years. She thought you abandoned her. This letter, it might be the answer to everything." The man looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of disbelief and a glimmer of hope so profound it took Lisa's breath away. "Evelyn?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Evelyn, she's still here?" Chapter 6. A Tale of Two Letters. Lisa explained everything, quickly and concisely, about the recipe card, Evelyn's diary, and the decades of pain and unanswered questions. Robert listened, his face a mask of profound shock and sorrow. His hands still trembled, clutching the letter. I didn't know," Robert finally said, his voice raspy with emotion. "I swear, I didn't know she wrote to me. I never received this." He looked at the letter in his hand, then back at Lisa, his eyes pleading for her to believe him. "I was heartbroken when we fought. I knew I had hurt her with my pride. But I loved her, Lisa, more than anything. I went away to clear my head, to find a way to earn enough to come back for her without feeling like a charity case. I sent her letters, so many letters, and when I got no reply, I thought she had decided she couldn't forgive me, that she had moved on." Lisa's heart ached for both of them. A lifetime of misunderstanding, all because of lost communication. "What did you write in your letters, Robert?" He sighed, a deep, weary sound. "I begged her forgiveness. I explained my reasons for leaving, for needing to prove myself. I told her I would be back for her as soon as I could. I told her I loved her, and that the apple crumble pie, it was a symbol of my promise to return and bake it for her, for the rest of our lives. That 'will you forgive me?' on the back of the recipe card, it was a question not for abandoning her, but for my foolish pride, for walking away in anger, for making her doubt my love." Lisa felt a cold shiver. So Evelyn had misread it completely, and Evelyn's letter, hidden in the O. Henry book, had never reached Robert. "This letter," Robert said, his voice choked with emotion, opening the yellowed page. "This is from her, isn't it? What does it say?" Lisa gently took the letter. It was indeed Evelyn's handwriting, youthful and bold. She began to read, her voice soft, but clear enough for Robert to hear. "My dearest Robert," she began, reading Evelyn's youthful words, "I am so lost without you. Our fight, it haunts me. I know I was proud too, and I said things I regret. If you are reading this, please know that my love for you is endless. My heart aches for you. I understand your pride, and I will wait for you. Please, just send word. Your apple crumble pie sits on the counter, untouched. It is a reminder of our love and a silent plea for your return. Come back to me, my love. Forgive me for my harsh words. I will always, always love you. Evelyn." As Lisa read, Robert's face crumpled. Tears streamed down his weathered cheeks. "She waited," he whispered, his voice thick with anguish. "All these years she waited, and I thought she had forgotten me." He looked at the letter, then at Lisa, his eyes filled with decades of unspent sorrow and regret. How could this have happened? How could our letters have been lost? Lisa didn't have an immediate answer. Perhaps they were lost in the mail. Perhaps they were intercepted, a cruel twist of fate, or more sinisterly, a deliberate act. But the immediate truth was clear. Two hearts, meant to be together, had been cruelly separated by a tragic lack of communication. "Robert," Lisa said, her voice firm, "my grandmother is still in Nashville. She never married anyone else who could replace you. She thinks of you constantly. She's still hurt, but she deserves to know the truth. You both do. She deserves to finally forgive you and for you to understand that she never stopped loving you." Robert looked up, his eyes meeting hers. A fragile hope slowly blooming amidst the pain. "She's here? She would see me?" "I believe so," Lisa said, a profound sense of purpose filling her. After all these years, she deserves to know that her Robert never forgot her, and that he asked for forgiveness not for abandoning her, but for the very pride that led him to leave. And she deserves to know that she was never forgotten. A long, trembling breath escaped Robert's lips. "Take me to her, Lisa," he said, his voice barely audible. "Please, take me to my Evelyn." The journey to Evelyn's house felt heavy with the weight of 50 years. Lisa drove slowly, allowing Robert time to compose himself, though she knew nothing could truly prepare them for this moment. The Nashville sun, which had once shone on young lovers, now cast its gentle glow on a reunion decades in the making. The recipe of forgiveness was finally ready to be baked. Chapter 7. The sweetness of forgiveness. The drive to Evelyn's house was a blur of emotions for Lisa. Robert sat silently beside her, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. A mixture of trepidation and desperate hope etched on his face. He held Evelyn's letter, now crinkled from his grasp, as if it were the most precious artifact in the world. When they arrived, Evelyn was sitting on her porch swing, just as Lisa had left her. She looked up as the car pulled into the driveway, her eyes widening as she saw Robert. Her hand flew to her mouth, a silent gasp escaping her lips. Robert slowly, painfully, got out of the car, his eyes never leaving Evelyn's. 50 years had passed. His hair was silver, his movements slower, a testament to time's relentless march. But in his eyes, Evelyn saw the young man she had loved so fiercely, and in her, Robert saw the woman he had never stopped loving. He began to walk towards her, each step a testament to the decades that had separated them. Evelyn, still frozen on the swing, slowly rose to her feet, her own steps faltering as she moved towards him. "Evelyn," Robert's voice was a low, shaky whisper, filled with a lifetime of unspoken words. "Robert," Evelyn breathed, her voice equally fragile. They stood before each other, separated by only a few feet, yet by a chasm of 50 years. The silence was deafening, broken only by the chirping of crickets and the distant hum of Nashville. Robert reached into his pocket and pulled out the faded recipe card. "This," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "this was for you, my grandmother's recipe." And the words on the back, he looked directly into her eyes, his own brimming with tears. "Will you forgive me? I asked you to forgive my pride, Evelyn. My foolish, stubborn pride that made me walk away in anger. Not my love, never my love." Evelyn's eyes, filled with a lifetime of hurt and misunderstanding, now shone with a new light, the light of revelation, and then, slowly, of profound understanding. "And this," she said, her voice stronger now, "this was for you." She held out the letter Lisa had given her, the one from the O. Henry book. "It never reached you. I waited. I always waited." Robert took the letter, his gaze sweeping over the familiar script. He read it silently, his face contorting with emotion. When he looked up, tears streamed freely down his face. "Oh, Evelyn," he choked out. "My Evelyn, I thought you had forgotten me. I sent so many letters. I thought you had moved on, that you couldn't forgive me for leaving." "And I thought you had abandoned me," Evelyn whispered, her own tears falling freely. "I thought you never wanted to see me again, that the forgive me was for deserting me." The truth, a cruel, simple truth of lost letters and misinterpreted words, hung between them. All those decades of pain, all that unspoken sorrow, all those lost moments, all due to a tragic misunderstanding. Slowly, hesitantly, Robert reached out. Evelyn met him halfway, their hands, gnarled by time, found each other, interlocking as they had so many years ago. It was a touch that spanned half a century, a bridge across a chasm of sorrow. Then, wordlessly, they embraced, an embrace of two souls finally finding their way back to each other, shedding the heavy cloak of regret and misunderstanding. Tears flowed freely from both of them, tears of sorrow for the lost years, but also tears of profound relief and overwhelming joy. Lisa watched, a silent witness to a love story decades in the making, finally finding its true ending. The weight of the past, so heavy in Evelyn's house, seemed to lift, replaced by an ethereal light. Later that evening, the three of them sat around Evelyn's kitchen table. Robert, with a surprising spryness, insisted on baking the apple crumble pie. Evelyn watched him, a soft, content smile gracing her lips, a smile Lisa hadn't seen in years. As the scent of cinnamon and baked apples filled the air, the aroma a balm to old wounds, Robert looked at Evelyn. "Evelyn," he said, his voice soft, Do you forgive me?" Evelyn reached across the table, taking his hand. Her eyes, clear and bright, met his. "There's nothing to forgive, Robert," she said, her voice filled with a love that had never truly died. "There was only a misunderstanding, and now it's gone." She squeezed his hand. "The question is, Robert, will you forgive me for my harsh words, for my pride, for not trusting in our love enough to search for you?" Robert smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that erased years from his face. "Always, my Evelyn. Always." The pie, when it came out of the oven, was golden brown, bubbling with apple goodness. It was the same pie from the faded recipe card, the one that had carried so much sorrow. But tonight, it tasted of forgiveness. It tasted of reunion. It tasted of a love that, against all odds, had found its way home. Lisa watched her grandmother and Robert, their hands clasped across the table, their eyes filled with a peace that had been absent for decades. She realized then the profound power of forgiveness, not just for the recipient, but for the one who gives it. Evelyn, released from the chains of anger and unanswered questions, seemed younger, lighter, her spirit renewed. Robert, free from the burden of unacknowledged apologies, radiated a quiet contentment. For Lisa, the journey to uncover a 50-year-old secret had been more than just a detective hunt. It had been a lesson in the enduring nature of love, the corrosive power of misunderstanding, and the transformative grace of forgiveness. She understood now that sometimes the greatest stories aren't found in grand gestures, but in the faded ink of a recipe card, asking the question that finally, after half a century, received its sweet answer. The Nashville night settled around them, a blanket of peace, as two reunited souls finally tasted the true sweetness of forgiveness.